Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world.
On today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by author Thomas McMullan to chat about his latest novel, Groundwater. Thomas is a writer, poet and artist based in Ramsgate. His short fiction and poetry have been published in Granta, the Dublin Review and Best British Short Stories, and his journalism has appeared in The Guardian, The Financial Times, Times Literary Supplement and BBC News, to name a few. Thomas also writes script for stage and film and creates narrative design for video games. He was the lead writer on Rollerdrome, which won the 2023 BAFTA for Best British Game. His debut novel, The Last Good Man, was published by Bloomsbury in 2020 and won the 2021 Betty Trask Prize. It was praised by Margaret Atwood as a scarlet letter for our times. His latest novel, Groundwater, is out now and published by Bloomsbury, and here to chat all about it. Welcome, Thomas, to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, thanks for having me, Hannah.
Thank you so much for coming on. For our listeners, I will just say that my mic has been a nightmare this morning, so apologies for any issues with my sound quality, but Thomas here has been very patient.
Yeah, no worries.
And hopefully we can crack on now with the important stuff, the book chat. So before we get into your new book, I would love to ask you what you're currently reading.
Yeah, I've started quite recently reading the new book from Jon Fosse, who won the Nobel Prize, the Norwegian writer. He won it a couple of years ago. It's called Vame, and it's so far about a guy in a fishing village who's looking for some black thread to buy to stitch something up, which sounds thrilling. But if you read, if you've read kind of Fosse's books before, they're kind of it's kind of an excuse in some ways for this kind of like there's this almost like hypnotic meditation of thought that the guy's kind of going on, and there's lots of boats in it as well. If you're into boats, so if you're into boats and black thread, it's the book for you.
I'm sure there's more layers to it than boats and black thread, but I love that. Now, let's get into your book, Groundwater. It is your second novel, and I speak to a lot of debut authors and other writers, and the debut authors seem to be slightly more confident about, maybe not confident is the right word, but they don't seem as afraid about their debut novel as authors seem to be about their second novel. It's like this infamous, difficult second novel. How has that experience been for you?
Yeah, it's interesting that's interesting. Yeah, that people, I think because it's like when there's two, it's like a pattern, people can start kind of gleaning a pattern. So I think it definitely feels like you have to be a little bit more, well, not that it's not that you're not purposeful with your first novel, but I think with your second, there's definitely a sense of like, how you're reinforcing or changing the type of thing that you're kind of your wheelhouse in a way. So yeah, I don't know. I guess like I do feel conscious of that, like how it's interesting as well, like not getting pitched so much as like a debut. I think very much like there's this language around debuts and being a debut, and then when it's a second book, you're kind of just like, oh, it's a new book. So there's also a kind of freedom with that in some ways. Like it's like, what one of hopefully several books that you're going to write. So yeah, conscious of, I guess, reception, but then also it's quite freeing not to be, have so much kind of focus on like the debut.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a lot of pressure with the debut to, if you've been waiting a while to put this book out into the world, there's a pressure to kind of write everything you've ever wanted to write and get everything down on the page. And then once you've kind of gone through that process, it's like, okay, what's next to write? So it's an interesting sort of relationship for authors with the debut and with the second. Before I ask you anything else about Groundwater, could you tell the listeners what it's about?
Yeah, so Groundwater's about a married couple, John and Liz, and they've recently moved out of London into this kind of slightly ambiguously placed area of woodland. And the book's set over a kind of week or so period, late August, around the kind of August bank holiday. And John and Liz, they're kind of, I'd say, like teetering on big questions about the future. So this idea of a child or infertility, this idea of futures some kind of idea of futures, and then what happens if that future doesn't come. It kind of ripples throughout, like throughout the different
Yeah.
characters. So they're there, and over this period, they're joined by so Liz, her sister, and her sister's family have kind of come to stay. So the husband and then two kids, and then there's also a small cast of other characters. Like there's some local students in a who are staying in a campsite locally. I mean, and then there's this kind of slightly strange groundskeeper called Sweet. And yeah, it kind of plays out these kind of dynamics between the characters over this week period. But at the core of it is this, I guess, this kind of moment of crisis between the couple. And a lot of it's about, I guess, what is being said and what isn't being said, and then how things that aren't said can come out in different ways, kind of potentially quite strange ways as well.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting. It's almost more interesting what isn't being said than what is being said. I think it tells you a lot more about the characters. You play with these sort of shifting perspectives in the book. Where did the idea for that come from? Like, why did you want to use both John and Liz's voice in this book?
Yeah, so there's it's kind of like very, very kind of close third. So we've got this, I like to think of it as like, I guess, like a big beam of light.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of constantly having this lens of either John or Liz kind of held
I
up.
love that.
So we're all so we only ever kind of see the narrative kind of as it's reflected or focalized through John and Liz, and it kind of continuously kind of shifts from one to the other. And like a really like when I was working on the book at a really early stage, it was, I think I just had one voice and I was just playing with one voice. And then it felt like it was lacking a kind of drama in terms of a tension between perspectives. So I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of play around then with, so much of the book is about them and their connection and their, I guess, like, well, connection, but also their kind of isolation. And it just felt like a real kind of rich theme to play with, that where you kind of constantly kind of do pivot between these two voices and see the moments in which they do meet and they do diverge. So kind of, big inspiration for that was To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. But there you've got like, I don't know, like 13 or like a lot of different characters, and it's kind of
Yeah.
constantly floating between these different characters. So I kind of love that idea. I really love that book. But I kind of wanted to make it quite tight and almost a bit claustrophobic, just between these two ways, these two kind of lenses to the world.
I think you do create this really great claustrophobic kind of unsettling atmosphere, and the book is set in this remote house by a lake that they've just moved into, and it's the kind of setting that you'd find in a horror film.
Yeah.
Did you intend for the setting to have this sort of unsettling atmosphere to it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I didn't like have kind of horror so consciously like in my head when I was kind of like ended up writing like that. It was more this idea of I quite enjoyed having like a place separate. So it's almost like a theatre set almost. It's almost,
Yes.
it feels quite like a kind of closed environment. And so it was more that I was playing with. But then I think definitely there are elements of, this idea of like staying in a lakeside house and that, it feels definitely there's like horror tropes there. And I'm not against that. I guess it's interesting, like it's kind of so obvious because now if people say that, you're like, oh yeah, that is a bit that is quite horror like. But yeah, no, I mean, I think in some ways I don't mind that. I think it's interesting how it kind of sets up certain expectations or
Yeah.
certain kind of, yeah, maybe, anticipating what might be the source of drama and then that being something else. I kind of like playing around with that a little bit. So I'm not against it. But yeah, I guess I was just being I should have been more aware of like that playing into that horror trope in some ways.
No, I really enjoyed it, and I think it is this idyllic setting in one sense, but it does also have the potential to create that unsettling atmosphere. And I think there is almost a nightmarish quality to in the way that people just keep turning up unannounced and
Yeah.
uninvited, and I mean that in the way that like that would be my worst nightmare, of people just constantly turning up at my door and just letting themselves in and just like helping themselves to all my stuff, and me not knowing when they're gonna leave. And
Yeah. I think no, you're right. I think in some ways it's interesting, like the horror stuff, because I guess like it's more that shared thing of it being like it's a kind of it's like a psychological space more than a real space. So that
yes.
it is a like I do kind of set it in a particular time, and there is a kind of vague sense of it, like where I was basing it, but it's largely like this, yeah, like a kind of ambiguous space, a bit like something from like a Samuel Beckett play, where
Yes.
like in Waiting for Godot, they're in a kind of hill, they're by a tree, but you don't really
Yes.
know where it is precisely. It's that kind of sense of like a kind of unreal psychological space almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Why did you feel that John and Liz wanted to move to this setting though? Like why did they want to escape the city?
Yeah, so I mean, I was writing this, yeah, over like quite a few years, but definitely like COVID and around that
Yeah.
period. So the novel is set, although I don't make too much of COVID, there's a few kind of references. It's set in 2021, it's the August of 2021. And I guess against that backdrop of, the first kind of set of lockdowns, and at that time, like a lot of people were moving out of cities, and there was this kind of fantasy almost of
Yeah.
a kind of rural, so I think the idea of the city had become quite like unreal as well. It had felt quite kind of
Yeah.
nightmarish. It's so strange talking about it now because it's like I think we've suppressed so much of that. But yeah, so there's that backdrop, but then I think also I am interested in that idea of this like almost fetishization of like nature and that sense of, oh, like this is a more authentic existence. And I think they're both on some level kind of searching for authenticity, like that sense of something that feels authentic to them. And that idea that comes from nature and comes from this like isolated place. And then there's also this idea of, so they've been trying for a child.
Yeah.
And so I think partly it's that sense of like, okay, there's this, we have to move into like a place where a family can inhabit. But then without that, it can suddenly feel like quite a big empty space.
It's really interesting you saying about the, trying to find that relationship to nature. I think during the lockdowns, we didn't really have much choice. There wasn't really much else to do. So we all started, taking advantage of the 1 hour walks we were originally getting. And then gradually they got longer and longer. And it was a time where all you could really do is walk to the local park and sit in your garden and have that. So it's interesting that they've kind of done this really dramatic version of it where they're like, we're going to move to this lake house where there's a forest around it and we're going to really lean into this lifestyle.
These strange objects start appearing from the lake and stuff.
Yes. Well, let's actually talk about those unsettling dreamlike sequences because they're sort of interspersed between the scenes in the book, and these sequences are kind of like your protagonists are sat on a boat in the middle of the lake. Is that right? And they have these random objects kind of coming towards them. What inspired those sequences?
Yeah, so like as I said, like the bulk of the chapters it's like third person kind of close, and then it kind of pivots in these like at the end of each chapter to first person.
Yes.
It's a bit ambiguous, like who's talking. But yeah, so the John and Liz, and they're kind of like I guess like dreams is the easiest way to think about them, but then it's a bit unclear like if they are or aren't happening because,
Yes.
there's kind of references to things that happened in the day, but they kind of stand aside from the day. And then, yeah, each chapter, which pretty much takes place over a day, there's an object that appears. So, whether it's a mirror or a hammer or, I think, yeah, I was really into this idea just of objects and this idea of like tangible things. And it felt like they get to this house and it's full of clutter and like the previous inhabitants of the house, there's lots of like traces of them. So this idea
Yes.
of like ownership and objects. And for me, and I kind of want to leave it open to interpretation with the objects that come on the lake, but there's this sense of, as we said, the things that aren't being said, or these dynamics that aren't being allowed to play out and in some ways are being suppressed are kind of coming out in these objects that are kind of like bubbling to the surface. But also I think this idea of like playing out certain things with these objects. So yeah, I don't know, it's interesting. Like in a really going back to this like horror idea, like a really, really early version, it's like I was playing more with bodies surfacing. So this, which is again, I should have been like, oh yeah, this is clear. And I think at that point, but I think at that point I was like, oh, I don't really want it to be about, because the problem then is that why are they not calling the police?
Yes, yeah.
Like it suddenly like it becomes, I don't know, anyway, so they kind of, these bodies became objects, but I think they've like retained a sense of being bodies almost. They're kind of
Yeah.
like surfacing, even if it's like a hammer instead of an actual body. So yeah, there's this idea of something that's suppressed kind of bubbling up. Like a really also like a really early reference point for the novel, like a really early inspiration was I was reading like a Guardian article about this couple and actually like an elderly couple in that story who I think are in America, but they're like experts at dredging lakes for bodies. They're just like I think they're retired and it's like a thing that they do as maybe a hobby. Well, probably I think it's like a line of work now, but they're like experts at this. And I
Wow.
don't know, there was just something about this idea of this couple like and things coming out of lakes that was an early inspiration. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from, but it's kind of like developed and become this strange dream-like sequence. Yeah.
No, I loved them. I mean, I'm really glad that you said it's unclear and it's kind of up to interpretation of like, what those sequences mean because it always makes me feel really stupid if the author won't say like, oh no, it's quite clear to me what that means. And I'm like, okay, it was just
Yeah.
but no, it was really interesting, and I think it was so interesting in terms of like their relationship and what they're experiencing, and the sort of cracks in them, and the sort of shifting power dynamics, and kind of not knowing where they stand with each other, and them being kind of isolated in the middle of this lake on a boat, like it's such a precarious situation to be in.
Mm.
I just think so much of it was a kind of reflection on what's going on in their kind of inner lives and how they're feeling about the other person. So
Yeah.
I really enjoyed those sequences. I want to ask you, going back to, you mentioned before about how they're trying to conceive, and they
Mm.
have been for a couple of years. And, they're navigating that alongside this very recent move. Their house is still not kind of set up. And Liz's sister then arrives with her husband and children in tow. Why did it feel important to kind of bring in Liz's sister and her family amidst their kind of struggles that they're dealing with?
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. They came in like really early, like those guys. I think they were really core to like the dynamic. I mean, I was like the kind of John and Liz is the kind of core kind of pairing, but then I was really interested in exploring something I really enjoyed writing was like the relationship between the sisters as well.
Yes.
So this idea of Monica and Liz, and I find sibling relationships really interesting, and this idea ultimately a lot of the dynamics in the book are about kind of how much we can ever like know someone else or how we have kind of solidified people in our lives into roles
Yeah.
and I think for Liz and Monica this idea of how as sisters there's a bit in the book I think Liz talks about sometimes her sister feels like an actor who like was known for playing a role early in her life. So this idea
Yeah.
of like she's always living in the shadow of being a sister when they were children, and it's never really kind of reached a new relationship. Like they've never kind of developed like a proper adult relationship with each other in the same way. And those kind of those I was that felt like something fun to play with. And then Harry, who's Monica's husband, he's quite an important character, and I kind of wanted this sense of I guess it's quite theatrical in a way, like this kind of the relationship between John and Liz also being thrown into perspective with these other relationships and these other characters. So it is quite stagey in a way. But yeah, I wanted to play with I guess all these like lines that you can draw between the different characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love reading any kind of story about sisters. It's like one of my favorite relationships to read about. I just think it's just a really interesting dynamic. And I was really fascinated by Liz and Monica's dynamic, but also by John and Harry's dynamic,
Mm.
because that shifts throughout the book. And I think, what you were saying with Liz and Monica, it feels like Liz is always kind of on edge around Monica and like, trying to sort of pinpoint what Monica's mood might be at any time. And there's a moment where Monica shuts herself away in her tent. And, Liz, I think maybe it was John or Liz suggest them going out to do something. And then
Mm.
Monica shuts herself away. And Liz is like, oh, well, why don't we go and have lunch somewhere? Like, that'll be nice. Like, let's go and do that. And it's like, she's almost like, treading on eggshells around her. And I
Mm.
just really love reading that because obviously there are the cracks in Liz and John's relationship that we're exploring, but then it was also interesting to kind of see what Liz's childhood might have been like and why she chooses to respond to John in certain ways now is probably a reflection of what their family life was like growing up. So I just really love that. It's not really a question. I just really enjoyed
Oh,
reading
thank
about their
you.
dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like juicy stuff, isn't it? I think we're so
Yeah.
like, so I just, it's I'm really interested in, I guess, just like all these little things about us, and the people we love or just the people we have in our lives that kind of ripple out, and all the, I guess, these like psychologies that that get shaped by these other relationships and these other, we're always kind of in flux as people because of other people, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back as well to John and Harry, because I think that their relationship is really interesting, and I think it almost tells us like a lot about masculinity in the way that they respond to that. There's a moment where Harry's foot is bleeding, and John comes into the room when his foot is bleeding, and he's trying to have this conversation. They're trying to have this conversation, and Harry's talking about like various different things, but John just can't take his eyes off the foot, and he just keeps repeating like, I just want him to sort out his foot. Like, why is he not getting rid of the blood? Like, why is he not doing that? And he's almost disgusted by this sort of vulnerability in Harry. And I just found that moment really interesting. Was masculinity something that you were consciously exploring in this book?
Yeah, totally. I think, I think with John and Harry, I think also, I guess, how ideas of masculinity are tied into ideas of fatherhood and children, and
Yes.
so that there's potential, because there's, I guess, I find a lot of book, there's loads of books that are brilliant about motherhood and kind of the idea of how, women might relate to children. But I feel like sometimes like it gets like there's I don't find as much about this kind of idea of how masculinity gets shaped by these kind of ideals of kind of parental relationships and stuff. So I don't know. So that feels like it's part of the mix. But then also, yeah, there's this idea of, I guess, also with the students as well. They feel like part of that, where there's kind of, maybe as the students are a bit younger and kind of shifting ideas of masculinity, and how then John kind of posits himself in relation to Harry, but then also the students, and then Harry feels maybe aspects of his masculinity being challenged, or this idea of, because he's a kind of academic, but then he's also being quite vulnerable. Like there's this kind of strange faints and kind of illnesses he keeps having. And I think it's interesting you say there that John feels kind of, yeah, disgusted almost by
Yeah.
that vulnerability. And I think that rigidity of like, there's a kind of competition, but then actually seeing like the competition between the two guys on some level, but then actually seeing the vulnerability is actually more worrying in some ways to John.
Yeah.
It's more kind of like undermining of like the rules of masculinity that he kind of sees. So that sense of, yeah, Harry's vulnerability in spite of his, is he's quite a loud and kind of dominating character. Like those two things, how John kind of sits with them is, yeah, something I wanted to play around with.
No, I mean, I loved their dynamic, and I thought it revealed so much to us about John. And just on that, I was really curious thinking about this last night, just in terms of the students and the warden. And you said before about the students, they're quite young, and they're very hopeful, and they really believe that like they can change things, and that they can have some kind of impact in terms of like politics, and they're very politically and socially aware. And it feels like, in contrast, the two couples, Monica and Harry, and John and Liz, are almost like jaded, and they're kind of they've been like downtrodden by the world. And I suppose in 2021 we're all feeling a bit kind of hopeless. But I was really interested in the way they reacted to each other, and as well with the warden, this local warden that just kind of shows up quite a lot. And I was curious whether you feel that it's strangers that reveal more to you about your characters than the people that are close to them, or whether you think there's kind of benefits to introducing both. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No. I mean, yeah, that's lovely. I think there's loads of things to like pick up there. I think the definitely. I mean, it's kind of like, I think maybe it's again quite a theatrical thing, but it's quite hard. I always find like you need to throw, like, to see a person, you kind of have to throw a different chemical element into the mix, and sometimes that can be someone you've known for ages and a family member, but sometimes, yeah, the stranger, or like with, so the warden's suite, there's I think ideas of class there as well, and
Yes.
how John and Liz, I mean, John's kind of unemployed in the story, but like they're largely kind of middle class. And then, how they in this place kind of a sense of like ownership of place, but at the same time, this kind of working class guy who is actual kind of ownership of, or like ownership in terms of knowledge, how they're kind of sitting with that. And then like with the students, like I think there's a kind of optimism, but also a kind of, like, it's interesting. They do have an optimism and they're quite motivated, but then they do characterize themselves as like nihilists in some ways, or there's this
Yeah.
idea of like, but nihilism less in a Big Lebowski sense of, and more the kind of like Russian nihilism of like the, late 19th century, this idea of kind of wanting a more disruptive political future, but still this kind of sense of like action and a potential for action. And I guess I wanted to play like, again, that sense of like a future and, whether that's a personal sense of a future with a child or with a future in your life, but then also this idea of a political future and a social future and how, this the hope for that, but then also the kind of what if there isn't change? What if there isn't the scope for change? Like what happens then? So yeah, I guess that idea of like the hopes for a future and then what the fear of those hopes not being realized, I wanted to kind of play around with on a kind of political level as well as kind of personal.
Yeah, I want to go back to, you just mentioned class there with obviously the warden and with Liz and John, and there are kind of tensions around money in the book. And I really liked the way that you wrote about wealth and privilege. I've got a page here. Do you mind me reading a little bit just so
No,
I
go
can
for it.
give
Yeah,
the
yeah.
listeners a taste? Sorry. So you wrote, when you're at university, you think you're the same, but when the time comes for homes and children, that's when you see who gets a leg up. The muscles of familial wealth stand out and you realise they have always been there for them, hidden from view, ready if ever needed beneath the gas bills. The money is one thing, but it's a realisation that they are not just themselves, you are not just yourself. And what do? Grow bitter, grow apart? Do you pretend not to notice, convince yourself that you do not care? There, the bitterness, when she was the one with a house and so keen to make her sister jealous. Hypocrite. She was part of it. The cares that took all of them sooner or later. And I just really enjoyed the way you explored that and the way that our kind of class structure, I don't know, it shifts so much and our kind of positions in terms of class. Like I'm from a working class background, but then I suppose that whilst I have multiple jobs now, I'm still sort of working class, but then I can occasionally afford holidays. So then where does that place me? And I just think it's so interesting to think of like how our positions in class sort of shift as we get older and we grow and change.
Yeah, I think I find this. I think particularly like when so like they're in their 30s, and I think that idea where I think people can hide class support so much in. There's this like role playing that people who have privilege, I mean, we all, I guess, to various degrees have, I don't want to kind of paint everyone with the same brush, but I think there's this when families start coming into it, like the idea of you having a family, I think then you can, like, I've found like the kind of sense of almost like disillusionment that like, oh, we're not all playing the same game.
Yeah.
You've been playing a different game or you've had different rules in the game. And again, it's this idea like, what do you do? Do you grow bitter? Do you kind of, do you become disillusioned? But yeah, that idea more broadly of class. I mean, like like my granddad was, carpenters, and like I remember going to he's Irish and going to see where he grew up, and now it's like a stable where horses live, like and I think it was like a family of 12 or whatever. But then my dad on that line was an academic. He's retired now, so it's kind of like then there's a heritage of kind of working class, but then you kind where do you posit yourself? So now and again as a writer, it's an interesting one because just personally, it's like there's a certain sense of like cultural capital you have with that, but then it's a real struggle to
actually
put
not
bills
much
together.
money in the
And I have
arts
to
at
do
all.
loads of little jobs like and it's so how you kind of that idea of I think particularly within I guess like the British approach to class and that idea of like lineage of family and class versus a kind of like individual sense of social strata or where you posit yourself. So I don't know, but so I think in the book John and Liz, I don't get the sense that they're like particularly well off, but they're essentially young professionals.
Yeah.
Or Liz is John is a kind of like freelance translator who's out of work. But they came into like some random inheritance, and I think there's this sense, this sense of like how do you posit yourself amongst your friends when it gets to that point in your life when you start seeing who's had a leg up, who has the support, but then you yourself have had certain lucks and certain things that have come in. So are you a hypocrite for kind of pointing the finger at others for being, wealthy in some ways. It's a hard thing. I find it
Yeah.
really knotted, and it's not an easy thing to square. And it can really, I think, it can really kind of like challenge dynamics and relationships. And I think, it's easier that for a lot of that stuff to be subsumed, I find in your 20s. But
Hmm.
when you're kind of, if it's this idea of a career or a family, but when it gets to that point, I think a lot of these like, I don't know, these like structures kind of make themselves known, I
Yeah,
found.
yeah. I think it's funny, isn't it? Because you said that you don't imagine them to be quite well off, but I mean, it's a pretty dire position to be in. That money is so kind of, I don't know. It's not great that you're having to wait for somebody to die for you to inherit their money in
Yeah,
order to have a kind of comfortable existence. Like, what
yeah.
exactly is going on if that's the state of where we're at?
Yeah, the fantasy of home ownership. Yeah, someone have
Yeah,
to.
yeah, that's literally
Yeah,
where I'm at right now. I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to own a home unless somebody like pops the clogs, and I don't really want
yeah,
anybody to be doing that. So,
yeah. No, I mean it's impossible. I mean, yeah, I don't. It's. I mean, there's been loads of great books written about this kind of, this
yeah,
idea of like, like Holly Pester's The Lodgers and stuff. But this idea of like, perpetual lodging or renting, and this idea of like property. Yeah. It's really interesting actually reading something like older, like Middlemarch or something, and because that's got loads about home ownership and the politics of that. And it's interesting actually seeing kind of comparisons of that of
yeah,
that point to anyway, but yeah, taking that larger canvas of like how like the essentially the politics of property have like changed,
yeah.
over time. Yeah.
Massively. I wanted to say as well that I really love, this is just on a totally different topic now, but I really love the way that you play with contrast in the book. We have these moments in the book of kind of quiet intimacy. We have like a brushing of shoulders or a handhold or a kiss or something like that, brushing up against these moments of quite intense rage and violence. And I'm not going to mention what those moments are because I don't want to give any spoilers, but I was curious what drew you to exploring those sort of contrasts in our behavior.
Yeah, I'm really like I find like gestures really fascinating. Like I've done like I was so interested I like decided to take like a few acting classes. So I've been because I find which was like brilliant by the way. I'd really recommend writers do acting classes just because I think we're so used to writing, or like as writers, we're doing so much with the body in terms of
Yeah.
describing it. But then if you don't actually kind of think about what a body does when it's
Hmm.
expressing stuff, it can sometimes you can get kind of stuck on the same old, calling on the same old
Yeah.
expressions. But yeah, this idea of how body language betrays certain things, or just a small thing like a small, like someone accidentally putting a hand on you or, brushing up against you can have quite big ripples and can kind of become something in the mind that feels disproportionate to what it is,
Hmm.
and it might be that that small seed that was planted kind of then ripples to become this big kind of moment of violence or this moment of, kind of rupture. And instead of them being kind of separate things, there's kind of like a continuity of gesture in terms of how we, I guess, think about essentially it's like expression, isn't it? And it's one might be small or quiet and one might be big and loud,
Yeah.
but there's a kind of continuity there between those things. And, something that might feel like it was nothing or like a small thing can kind of inside your head kind of grow bigger and bigger until it becomes this much larger thing that gets expressed.
Yeah, definitely. Was the acting classes Meisner by any chance?
I did a few. Yeah, Meisner technique is really kind of gestural based, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I did a few. I mean, these were just a City Lit, which is great. Like, shout out to City Lit in London. They do really good, affordable adult education classes. But they did a bit of Meisner, a bit of like, kind of ideas of objective. And I
Yeah.
guess it's really interesting actually talking to actors because they, I guess, because of their training, have like such a kind of fundamental understanding of like objective, like see how scenes work and this
Yeah.
idea of dialogue always being imbued with action in some ways, like even
Yeah.
if it's not like a literal action, and that's very, what's your man, the big guy?
Stanislavski.
Yeah, Stanislavski,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, yeah. It's that idea of like you know, always having a kind of action with like actioning a script or like verbing it. And that helps an actor then kind of take something and make it really dynamic. But I think it's a really useful thing for writers to be aware of as well, like
Yeah.
thinking about how like lines or like dialogue in particular, but just like layers of expression can kind of work simultaneously. Anyway, yeah, maybe getting off topic, but I find that a really
No,
useful
I
thing.
mean,
Yeah.
I'm an actor, so this is like I love chatting about
Oh, nice. Oh,
art.
that's really interesting. Well, like, can I ask you a question? Like,
Go
so
for
how do
it.
you how do you find then, like, with the so you know your work as an actor and then kind of reading, like, or I don't know if you do writing as well, but
I
if
do
like, how
write
do you
sometimes,
find the
yeah.
relationship between those two? Like, how do you come to it?
I think because I'm so used to breaking down a script and, really kind of dissecting lines of dialogue and like what's being said, but what is maybe under the surface of that line of dialogue and like what's actually going on for the characters. I think I spend so much time with character and dialogue that that's usually what I'm so focused on when it comes to reading books,
Mm,
and to writing. I suppose dialogue is a big part of it. I mean, I've mainly written for theatre, so
mm.
it's sort of still within that world anyway. But I have been trying to write prose, and I found that I'm just so much more drawn to writing dialogue, and I think it's because of that background. Yeah, I think dialogue is something that I'm just so fascinated by, and
Mm.
sort of the things that you're playing with, the things that are said, the things that aren't said. Yeah, I just find that all really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's really like because with prose, like you know, you can have dialogue, but then I guess like the gift of prose is you can also show what is going inside them, right? So
Exactly.
you can kind of
Yeah.
unpack that actor's
Yeah.
process, and you can
Yeah.
have you know that layer, that kind of external layer, but then also have that interior layer, and the
Yeah.
kind of tensions between the two can be like really fun to play around with.
Yeah, there's a nice bit of freedom there in terms of trying to. I'm trying to write prose.
Oh
Um,
man, we're all just trying to write prose. Like we're all don't worry about that.
well,
Yeah.
that's a nice boost. Thank you. I want to ask you as well because Liz is a writer and
Mm.
we see snippets of her stories, which I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the full reveal of one of her stories. How did you go about, or how did you approach carving out her writing voice?
Yeah, so I kind of yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, in the novel she's kind of well, I mean she's work when we meet her in the novel she's kind of working for like a startup, you know, but she's kind of I think she you know previously was a writer and then there's this idea of her kind of meeting writing again and kind of, you know, in some ways having control. It's like a way of
Mm,
controlling things, I think, partly or like processing things. Yeah, her voice, that's interesting. I think I kind of I wanted to play with this idea of someone reflecting on writing that they did maybe when they were younger. And so there's kind of two voices. There's like a voice of her at maybe when she was writing in like her mid-20s, and then a voice now kind of like maybe like early to mid-30s, kind of this idea of finding a new voice. And I think the different things that like that it's interesting like going back to that idea of debuts and obviously you don't have to be young to be a debut writer, but that kind of idea of a kind of confidence when it's like first kind of writing in some ways, like a kind of I'm just going to throw everything at it and kind of
mhm.
really have it, versus that kind of coming to it later or kind of, you know, reiterating work later and then I don't know, being, yeah, I don't know, kind of weirdly like also separated from yourself. I like this
Yeah,
idea of someone reflecting on like an early version of themselves or seeing something. Like one of my favorite plays is Krapp's Last Tape, the Beckett play, and that in that there's this sense of him listening to tapes that he recorded when he was a younger man. And there's this idea of like meeting an earlier imaginative version of
yeah,
yourself in writing. And so the bit like there's quite a sexual bit in this bit that she kind of comes across from an early part in her writing, and it's kind of like how would she still write like that, or how would she? There's a bit where she's kind of reflecting on maybe the bodies that she was thinking about in that piece of writing, and then now what the bodies would be, or who you know. So there's this idea of part like writing, but then also I guess like how she saw herself, or how she saw like her sexuality, or how she kind of saw like an expression of desire, and then like whether there was a kind of performative element to that at that point, or whether it's become more performative, you know, now.
yeah.
So I don't know, that's in the mix, hopefully.
I know. I just found it really funny that you have this whole section of her writing this quite graphic sex scene, and she's reading it out to John, and you can tell there's a sort of I don't know. She's wanting to kind of get a reaction out of John, and she's reading this out, and it's a couple of pages of her doing this, and then you just write, and then they had sex on the upstairs landing. It's just like done with.
Yeah, I mean, writing sex is so hard, isn't it? But I think
Yeah,
that I think it's also, I guess, like the erotic aspect is the kind of reading and the listening and like the
yeah,
power structure there between
absolutely.
and I think that I mean, obviously, like there's brilliant sex scenes in literature, but I think sometimes it's not so much about describing the mechanics of sex as it's about like, what sex is, the kind of the dynamics between people ultimately.
Yeah.
There's, and that idea of reading something and then kind of encountering an earlier version of yourself, but then also performing that and then also knowing someone's listening to it. And there's also this thing of the student having previously read that.
Hmm.
And then anyway, but there's this kind of like power dynamic that is, for me at least in that scene, like more of the source of like the sex than the actual kind of like them having sex on the upstairs
No,
landing.
yeah, the I mean the build up between them was very sexy, like the build up of her reading it out to him. I thought it was, I don't know, it tells you more than just a normal sex scene would, doesn't it? Like it gives you more about them.
Yeah, they have bad sex at other points, so there's well, not I say bad, but like, fumbly kind of pressured sex, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, there is a pressure there for them, isn't there? I would love to chat to you for a lot longer about this book, but unfortunately, I do have to let you go. Before I let you go, I do like to finish on a recommendation, but I am going to sneak in a question to ask what is next for you, Thomas?
Yeah, so next, so I'm writing like early days a new novel, but it's like I kind of want to get this one out the door
Yeah.
and return to it. But I've kind of I've done like a good chunk of a new thing. So I'm kind of at the moment I'm playing around with it and playing around with the shape and some of the ideas. And like the last two books were very kind of rural in a way, like they were both set in the countryside. This one's set in London in a city, so I'm kind of setting myself a challenge of doing something.
I
But yeah,
love
so
that.
early days of that. So that's kind of what I'm up to. Yeah.
Very exciting. I always think it's really fascinating when a writer is releasing one book out into the world, but they're still having to work on something else. And I just wonder what that's like, switching between
Yeah,
those brains.
it's a strange thing like when you have a book out because kind of like the when it was really occupying space in your head in a real live way is probably like a year or two ago. It's like it's such a glacial process publishing. But then it's quite nice actually then returning
To
to it.
return to
I
it.
think there's a bit more distance, so you feel a bit like you can talk about them as if they're separate from you.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
listening to your podcast when you were talking to Saba Sams, and she was talking about, I think this like, which I really liked. She was talking about, I think, with a short story. Oh no, she was talking about Send Nudes, and she was saying how like looking at that now, I think this was when Gunk came out, it feels, different. Like it's not,
Yeah.
there's no instinct to try and change the sentences. Whereas with Gunk, because it's still quite new, or it was when she was kind of talking about it, that she was like, oh, I want to change that sentence
Yeah,
or
yeah,
like
yeah.
fill that, you know what I mean? So it has to kind of become like
You
solidified
need
and stuff.
fresh eyes
I
on
think,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. Can I ask you for a recommendation for the listeners?
Yeah, so I went to on the weekend. I went to Deptford X Festival, which is I think it's a biennial arts festival. So I'd recommend that, which is really good. If it's on for a couple of weeks, so it might be over by the time this is on, but it's on quite regularly, and they have lots of little art venues in different places in
Amazing.
Deptford. But I came across this really lovely, like my favorite piece of art that I saw there was by a guy called Richard Dean Hughes, and he does stuff with objects that are really weird. It's almost like they're glitching. So there was like this kind of like piano, but it was kind of made of wood and it was kind of halfway up the wall. And then there was these like pots that had some like mysterious kind of black sand in them, or maybe like ashes, I don't know, like kind of urn-like, but they're kind of getting smaller and smaller. So it's kind of like playing with like optical illusions, but I just really like how he played with material and made these objects that felt quite known, like a piano, feel quite strange and almost as if they're like digital artifacts that had been cut, rather than physical things. But yeah, that was really good. And it was in a gallery, which I'm probably going to like mispronounce, but I think it's Shira High. Shira High.
Amazing.
I'm gonna say. But yeah, Deptford. It's in Deptford.
Amazing. I will link those in the show notes so people can go and have a look. Thank you so much, Thomas, for coming on today and for chatting about your wonderful new book. I really enjoyed this book and I really enjoyed chatting to you about it.
Yeah, same. No, thanks so much, Hannah.
I
Cheers.
should ask as well, where can the listeners find you online, if anywhere?
Yeah, I've got Instagram, so I think it's just my name, Thomas McMullan. If you search for me on Instagram, and then I do have a Blue Sky, but I don't really use it
Fair,
much. If
I
you
don't.
want to, yeah, but I do. No, but yeah, I do have it. I did that standard thing of everyone like being like, yeah, I'm going to join it, and then didn't really do much
Yeah,
with
I
it.
did that with Threads.
Yeah, Instagram. I like
It's your
using
main
Instagram.
spot. Amazing, thank you. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Lastly, thank you once again, Thomas, and thank you listeners for listening. Goodbye.